A federal ICE agent shot and killed a 37-year-old woman in Minneapolis during an immigration enforcement operation, and city officials are now openly disputing the federal government's version of what actually happened. Now, that dispute is the story here. You see, on January 7th, federal immigration agents were operating in a residential neighborhood of Minneapolis as part of a large-scale DHS crackdown. Now, during that operation, an ICE agent opened fire. The woman was taken to a hospital with a head wound and later pronounced dead. According to the Department of Homeland Security, the woman weaponized her vehicle and attempted to kill federal officers. That is the federal account. The city's account is very different. Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, called the federal explanation, quote, bullshit. He said he had personally viewed the video of the incident, and he described the shooting not as self-defense, but as an agent recklessly using power that resulted in someone dying. That's not a nuanced disagreement, that's a complete break in narrative. And it matters because this did not happen in a vacuum. You see, at the time of the shooting, the Trump administration was intensifying an immigration crackdown across Minneapolis and St. Paul, involving roughly 2,000 federal agents. Now, federal officials have framed the operation as a response to illegal immigration and widespread fraud in the state's social services systems. Local officials say the federal presence itself is the problem here, because within hours of the shooting, hundreds of protesters gathered at the scene. People blew whistles, a tactic now commonly used to disrupt immigration enforcement. Others shouted at officers. The neighborhood itself was completely locked down. Now, the shooting took place about a mile from where George Floyd was killed by police back in 2020, a fact that immediately raised the emotional temperature of the entire city. You see, Minneapolis knows what escalation looks like, and the city leaders are clearly afraid of repeating it. Ilhan Omar, whose district includes the scene of the shooting, described the woman as a legal observer and accused ICE of terrorizing communities. She demanded federal agents leave the city immediately. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz urged calm while acknowledging public anger. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison warned that the deployment of armed immigration officers was spreading terror and said anyone who broke the law now must be held accountable. Meanwhile, federal officials stood by their version of the story, and this is where things get a little deeper. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara said there was nothing to indicate the woman was the target of any law enforcement action. She was not under investigation, and she was not being arrested. According to O'Hara, she appeared to be using her car to block a street where immigration agents were operating. Now, that detail of the story really matters here, because blocking a street is not the same thing as trying to kill someone. That's the core factual conflict here. Federal officials say the car was a weapon. City officials say it was a barrier. One interruption justifies lethal force. The other makes it look like a catastrophic overreaction. Now, as of now, we don't have a public authoritative answer on the situation, but what we do know is this. The FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension have taken over the investigation. Now, it's unclear whether one or both agencies will determine whether state laws were violated. The woman's identity has not yet been released. So right now, the public is being asked to choose which version of events to trust without full evidence of the situation. That is not a recipe for calm. That is a recipe for fracture. So here's the larger issue most of the coverage right now is skipping. This isn't about whether an agent fired legally. It's about federal authority operating inside cities that openly reject it. Minneapolis is not cooperating quietly with immigration enforcement. It is resisting it politically, publicly, and symbolically. Federal agencies are responding by pushing even harder. Now, that collision creates incentives on both sides. Federal agents are under pressure to show results. City leaders are under pressure to show resistance, and neither side wants to be seen as the one backing down. And when that happens, enforcement stops being procedural and starts being confrontational. That's when mistakes become deadly. Mayor Frey said something telling during his news conference. He said the Trump administration was looking for an excuse to occupy the city. That is a serious accusation. And whether or not you agree with it, it reveals how local officials now interpret federal presence, not as assistance, but as provocation. Federal officials say the crackdown could last weeks. And that is important because this shooting wasn't the end of an operation. It was on the beginning of one. And this wasn't the first time immigration enforcement has turned violent. News outlets have reported at least 10 shootings involving federal immigration agents since President Trump returned to office, including incidents in Chicago and Los Angeles. Now, that pattern changes how this moment should be understood. This isn't an isolated breakdown, it's part of a broader escalation curve that we're seeing. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Both sides can be acting within their roles and still produce an outcome that ultimately destabilizes everything. Federal agencies don't need local approval to enforce federal law. Cities don't need federal permission to condemn it. But when those two realities collide in residential neighborhoods, force becomes the tiebreaker. And force doesn't de-escalate tension. In fact, it locks it in. This story isn't about whether ICE should exist, and it's not about whether cities should resist. It's about what happens when there is no release valve between federal authority and local rejection. That's when every interaction becomes volatile, every crowd becomes a threat, and every vehicle becomes a potential weapon. And once that framing sets in, well, it doesn't fade. So here's the warning. If this becomes the new normal, federal crackdowns inside resistant cities, backed by armed agents, disputed by local leaders, then this will not be the last deadly encounter we see. In fact, it'll be the template. So expect more aggressive operations, expect louder condemnation, expect investigations that satisfy no one, and expect everyone involved to insist the system worked exactly as intended, because structurally, it did. I'm Hank, here to explain the chaos, not hype it. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place.